December of 1914 arrived with a quiet that was anything but peaceful. Across the fields of northern France and Belgium, frost clung to shattered tree stumps, turning the churned earth pale beneath a sky the colour of cold iron. Snow drifted into trenches that had once been green farmland, collecting on the splintered edges of sandbags and the stiff bodies of horses left where they had fallen months before. The air tasted of wood smoke, wet mud, and something metallic that never seemed to fade. It was the first winter of the Great War, and no one on either side had imagined it would come to this. When the war broke out in August, many soldiers marched off with music in the streets. Families cheered, flags waved, and governments promised a quick victory. Home by Christmas, mothers whispered to sons, sweethearts to lovers, and officers to their wide-eyed recruits. Yet by the time December arrived, those hopeful promises lay buried beneath miles of trenches carved into the earth like open wounds. The Western Front had become a stalemate, a frozen scar stretching from the North Sea to the borders of Switzerland. Between the opposing trench lines lay no man's land, a wasteland of barbed wire, shell craters, shattered equipment, and the unseen dangers of snipers and artillery. Life in the trenches tested the limits of human endurance. Soldiers fought not only the enemy, but the relentless cold. Boots froze stiff. Water from burst canteens turned to ice. Rats fattened themselves on discarded scraps, and the horrors no one spoke about openly. And yet, among all this misery, men clung fiercely to memories of home, warm kitchens, ringing church bells, family gatherings, the glow of candles on a Christmas tree. These memories became lifelines, comforts, proof that a world beyond the mud still existed. As Christmas approached, rumours drifted through the trenches like smoke. Some said the Germans planned something unusual. Others whispered that the French had heard singing in the night. Officers dismissed these murmurs as nonsense, but the rank and file felt something shifting, something subtle and unspoken. Even in war, people could sense when the world was holding its breath. The holiday season deepened the ache for home. Soldiers on all sides received parcels and letters from loved ones. Carefully wrapped tins of plum pudding, chocolate, pipe tobacco, knitted socks, and small bottles of brandy breathed life into weary spirits. King George sent British soldiers his now famous embossed metal tins filled with cigarettes or sweets. German families sent candles and treats. In the dim light of dugouts, men passed around parcels with trembling hands, laughing at familiar handwriting, wiping at their eyes when they thought no one noticed. It was a reminder. They were still human, despite what the war demanded of them. And then on Christmas Eve, something happened. Something so extraordinary that it would be remembered long after the gunfire finally fell silent. In scattered pockets across the Western Front, carols drifted into the night air. First in German, then softly in English. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The melody rose over the bitter cold, drifting above the barbed wire that divided enemies. And soon, to the astonishment of the British troops listening across the darkened expanse, the tune shifted as familiar English voices joined in with Silent Night. No one knew it then, but this moment would spark one of the most remarkable events in the history of modern warfare. Before we step deeper into this story, I'd love for you to take a moment and comment where you're listening from. Soldiers from more than a dozen nations fought on the Western Front, and in a way, our global holiday history community mirrors that same international tapestry. People from all corners of the world gathering to hear and share the stories behind our traditions. I always find it meaningful to imagine how far these tales travel. Tonight, we are going to walk through the frost-covered trenches of 1914. We will listen to the songs the soldiers heard, read the words they wrote home, and explore the courage and compassion that made the Christmas Truce possible. It's a story of humanity shining in the darkest of places, a reminder that even when the world seems broken, the light of Christmas still has the power to cut through the cold. Let's begin our journey. Part 1. Into the Mud. Winter on the Western Front. The Great War had not yet earned its grim title in the winter of 1914. To the men fighting in it, it was still a new conflict, barely 4 months old, but one that had already defied every expectation placed upon it. When the armies of Europe first mobilized in August, many believed they were participating in a brief, glorious campaign. Politicians predicted that any fighting would be over before the leaves fell from the trees. Newspapers printed illustrations of gleaming cavalry charges and swift victories. Soldiers posed proudly for photographs, confident they were marching toward honor, adventure, and swift triumph. What met them instead was something entirely different. By late September, both sides had realized that mobility, once the heart of 19th century warfare, was impossible in the face of machine guns, modern artillery, and barbed wire. Every offensive bogged down into chaos. Every attempt to break through the enemy's line ended in staggering casualties. With no choice but to dig in, British, French, Belgian, and German troops carved trenches into the soil, turning fields and farmland into a sprawling labyrinth of mud and misery. The trenches were not neat, reinforced constructions at first. Many were only shallow scrapes in the ground, hastily dug with entrenching tools, while bullets snapped overhead. Rain turned them into trenches of sludge. Water pooled at the bottom until it reached the height of a man's ankles. Boots squelched with every step. Soldiers balanced on makeshift wooden planks to avoid sinking into the muck, though the planks rarely held. At night, the temperature plummeted, and the mud hardened into jagged ridges that bruised and tore at skin. The conditions were so severe that trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to cold, damp environments, became almost inevitable. To fight it, soldiers rubbed their feet with whale oil, removed their boots whenever possible, and changed their socks compulsively. Even so, toes blackened, swelled, and sometimes required amputation. One British soldier wrote in a letter home that he had never imagined something as simple as a dry pair of socks could feel like a blessing straight from heaven. Hunger, too, was a constant companion. Rations varied from unit to unit, but for most men, meals were monotonous at best. British soldiers received tins of bully beef and hard biscuits so tough they sometimes cracked teeth. German soldiers, cut off from food imports by the British naval blockade, saw their rations deteriorate as autumn wore on. Bread was padded with sawdust. Meat was a luxury. Hot meals became rarities. The cold gnawed at empty stomachs, and the smell of stale fat clung to clothing in a way that never seemed to wash off. And then there were the rats. The trenches were overrun with them. bold, enormous creatures fattened on scraps and the unspoken horrors of war. They scurried over sleeping men, gnawed on leather belts, and nested in haversacks. Soldiers made games of trying to hunt them, though killing rats brought little comfort. For every one eliminated, another seemed to take its place. One French soldier dryly noted in his journal that the rats were the true victors of the Western Front. But the greatest burden of all was not the mud, or the cold, or the vermin. It was the fear. The front lines were rarely silent. Even on quiet days, the crack of rifle fire, the thump of artillery, or the distant rumble of shells interrupted any sense of calm. The threat of snipers forced soldiers to keep their heads low. A moment's carelessness, a silhouette against the skyline, the glint of a helmet, a movement too near a trench parapet, could mean instant death. Many soldiers learned to move in a strange, hunched way, as though the sky itself might strike them down. Night brought its own terrors. Patrols ventured into no man's land, those few hundred yards of broken earth between opposing lines. There, amid tangles of wire and the stench of decay, men crawled on hands and knees, listening for enemy movements. The darkness was so complete that soldiers often described it as suffocating. Only the occasional flare, bursting overhead in a sudden bloom of white light, revealed the shattered ground around them. Yet despite all this, a strange routine formed. Men woke at dawn for stand to, a period of heightened readiness in case the enemy launched a surprise attack in the early morning dimness. Breakfast followed if rations allowed. Then there were chores, repairing sandbags, draining water from the trench floor, reinforcing parapets, clearing debris. Letters were read and written during rare moments of quiet. Cigarettes were traded and smoked. Conversations drifted between jokes, fears, and whispered dreams of home. Christmas lingered in these conversations more often as December advanced. For many soldiers, it was their first holiday away from home. Young men barely out of school felt the absence of family traditions acutely. The smell of pine, the flicker of candles in a window, the sound of bells ringing through a village square. Others missed the warmth of a crowded kitchen, the laughter of siblings, or the simple familiarity of a favorite chair beside a fire. These memories tasted sweeter in their absence, sharpened by the knowledge that they were unreachable here. Soldiers found small ways to recreate the holiday spirit. Germans, who held the strongest cultural attachment to Christmas trees, received shipments of tabletop evergreens from home and placed them on dugout shelves or along trench parapets. British soldiers hung socks from the wooden beams of their shelters, laughing as they did so, even if they secretly hoped for some miracle of mail delivery. French soldiers carved tiny creche figures from bits of firewood, passing the time with their knives when boredom threatened to swallow them. Mail call became one of the most anticipated rituals of the season. Soldiers strained to hear their names shouted by the postman. Parcels tied with twine, letters carefully sealed with wax, and postcards dusted with the scent of perfume circulated through the trenches like treasured relics. Men gathered around each other, sharing their spoils, turning pages over and over just to admire familiar handwriting. Good news, however small, radiated outward. Bad news spread much the same way, darkening the mood of entire companies. Despite the comforts, melancholy hung heavy in the air. Many soldiers had already seen the horrors of war firsthand. They had lost friends in the early battles of the Ypres salient, the Marne, and the race to the sea. They had watched men fall to sniper shots, artillery blasts, or disease. Even the most light-hearted found their spirits shaken by what they had endured. Yet beneath the grief and exhaustion, something else was growing as Christmas approached. A quiet yearning, a hope, however faint, that the holiday might bring a reprieve from the constant terror. Perhaps it was naive, perhaps it was nothing more than wistful thinking. But human beings are built to seek light, even in the darkest times. And as the frosty nights deepened, whispers began to travel through the trenches, rumors of unusual behavior from the enemy, of songs drifting across the frozen fields, of gestures that hinted at something more than war. Most dismissed these murmurs as wishful inventions, but others listened more closely. After all, the men on the other side of no man's land were not so different. They too were cold. They too missed home. They too longed for a moment, just a moment of peace. None of them knew it yet, but they were standing on the threshold of something extraordinary, something that would forever capture the imagination of the world. Part 2. Carols Across No Man's Land. As Christmas Eve approached, the Western Front seemed to settle into a strange, expectant silence. Not a true silence. There was no such thing in that war, but a thinning of the usual violence, a slowing of the gunfire, as though both sides were too exhausted or too cold to spend their ammunition freely. The damp air carried the smell of spent matches, burnt rations, and the sourness of unwashed uniforms. Frost glittered on the strands of barbed wire that twisted like cruel vines across the landscape. Snow lay in patches, white against the churned mud, giving the battlefield a deceptively peaceful appearance. To the soldiers huddled in the trenches, the hours before nightfall on December 24th felt heavier than usual. Many found their thoughts drifting homeward more intensely than they had at any point in the war. Memories surfaced with startling clarity. A mother placing candles in a window, a father hauling a fresh-cut tree through the snow, a sister carefully wrapping gifts by the fire, the sound of church bells drifting over rooftops. These small details became anchor points, reminders of a world untouched by barbed wire and artillery. Throughout the afternoon, soldiers on both sides noticed subtle changes in the air. Not physical shifts, but shifts in behavior. On the German side, figures moved with a quiet purpose, as if preparing for something outside the usual routine of war. A few British soldiers reported seeing small evergreen trees being hoisted onto the German parapets. Others noticed lanterns glowing softly in dugouts. These unfamiliar shapes glimmered with candlelight, flickering like stars against the darkness of the trenches. At first, the British were suspicious. Any unusual activity might signal a ruse, a distraction before an attack. But as more trees appeared, tiny, decorated with makeshift ornaments, unease gave way to bewilderment. The Germans seemed to be celebrating. One British private, peering through a periscope fashioned from a shaving mirror, watched as a German soldier placed a candle on a branch, shielding the flame from the wind with cupped hands. The gesture was so ordinary, so reminiscent of home, that the private felt a lump rise in his throat. It was as if the two worlds, the world of Christmas and the world of war, were colliding in one fragile flame. As daylight faded, the landscape transformed. No man's land, usually a place of dread, became an eerie stage lit by dots of warm yellow light. Trees, candles, and lanterns glowed along the German lines. The British soldiers stared, murmuring quietly among themselves. Some laughed in disbelief. Others crossed themselves. A few simply watched in silence, unable to reconcile the beauty of the scene with the horrors of the last 4 months. Then, as darkness fully settled, the sound began. It started faintly, soft, almost ghostly. A melody floating through the night air, woven with the cold wind. At first, the British weren't sure they were hearing it correctly. Men tilted their heads listening hard. The notes grew clearer, rising above the crunch of frost beneath boots and the distant groans of the wounded. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The voices were unmistakably German. They rose in harmony, gentle yet strong, carrying across the dead space between the trenches. The carol, familiar even to those who couldn't speak the language, seemed impossibly pure amid the ruined landscape. The effect was immediate. British soldiers fell silent, captivated by the unexpected beauty of the song. For many, the last time they had heard Silent Night sung with such tenderness was back home, in crowded churches, in living rooms lit by firelight, or in the hushed comfort of a family gathering. Hearing it now, sung by the very men they were expected to kill, stirred emotions too complex to name. When the Germans finished the verse, a hush settled over no man's land again. It was not a tense silence, but a charged one, as though the battlefield itself were holding its breath. Then, from the British trenches, a single voice answered. It wavered at first, uncertain, but grew stronger as others joined in. Soon dozens of voices rose in reply, singing the same carol, this time in English. Silent Night, Holy Night. The two renditions drifted toward each other, meeting in the frozen air between the lines. Men who had been strangers, or enemies, only hours earlier, were suddenly united in song. The harmonies mingled like two candle flames leaning toward one another. When the British finished, they waited. A German soldier shouted something across no man's land, his voice muffled by the wind. English soldiers strained to make out the words. Then another shout came, clearer this time. "You sing! We sing! You sing again!" Laughter rippled through the British trenches. Without waiting for orders, they launched into another carol, this one cheerful and bright. The Germans clapped and cheered at the end. Then it was their turn again, singing a spirited anthem that prompted applause from the British. Back and forth the songs travelled, weaving a strange tapestry of sound between the trenches. The music softened the edges of fear. It warmed hands numbed by the cold. It awakened homesick hearts. Letters written after the war described that night as surreal. Some men said they felt as though they had slipped into a dream. Others wrote that the singing reminded them of Christmas Eve church services, where voices rose into the vaulted ceilings like prayers. A few admitted they cried openly. The war had already hardened many, but the simple act of listening to a familiar carol, performed by the enemy pierced through walls no artillery shell could breach. Between songs, voices called across the stretch of no man's land. Men shouted holiday greetings. Some cracked jokes. Others asked about the weather where their enemies came from, or whether they had received parcels from home. It was awkward, stilted, and filled with long pauses. But it was human. In one British sector, a German soldier with a particularly strong voice began singing a solo from an opera. The melody soared, drifting like a bird over the desolate landscape. When he finished, applause erupted from both sides. A British officer later wrote, "It was as if the guns had never been fired at all." As midnight approached, the singing grew softer, turning reflective. The cold deepened, and flares occasionally lit up the sky, bathing the landscape in harsh light before fading again. Yet even these reminders of war could not break the fragile connection taking shape between the trenches. The carols continued, warming the night like a shared breath. Some men whispered that this had to be a sign. Perhaps the war would end soon. Perhaps Christmas would bring peace after all. Others remained cautious, wary of hope. But as the singing rose and fell, it became difficult not to imagine a different world. A world where the men in the opposite trench were not enemies but neighbors. Where the boundary between nations mattered less than the simple fact that, on this night, everyone longed for the same thing: warmth, safety, and the comfort of home. In the darkness of December 24th, the first threads of the Christmas Truce had begun to weave themselves into history. No one knew where the night would lead, but the songs had planted something in the cold, hard soil. A longing for peace that would soon take shape in the most unexpected way. Part 3. The Day the Guns Went Quiet. Christmas morning dawned cold and pale, the sky a washed-out blue streaked with thin clouds that drifted slowly across the horizon. Frost thickened along the edges of sandbags and clung to the tangled knots of barbed wire that cut across no man's land. The songs of the night before still echoed faintly in the memories of the men who had heard them. Many British soldiers woke early, blinking the sleep from their eyes as they tried to decide whether they had dreamed it all. Others lingered under their blankets, hesitant to emerge into the freezing air, but filled with an inexplicable sense that something had changed. Across the lines, the Germans stirred as well. Some were already standing on their firing steps, peering cautiously towards the British trenches. Others crouched near their small Christmas trees, adjusting the candles that had burned low during the night. A sense of anticipation hung over both armies. There was no gunfire, no shouted orders, just a hush, strange, almost sacred, unlike anything the front had heard since the war began. Shortly after dawn, the first movements began. Along one sector of the line near the village of Plug Street Wood, a German soldier climbed out of his trench, raising his hands high above his head. His helmet glinted in the weak morning sunlight. For a moment, British soldiers stared at him, stunned. It was unthinkable to expose oneself so openly. A single shot could have ended him instantly. But no one fired. Instead, the man called out in accented English, wishing the British a Merry Christmas. Reports differ on which side stepped forward first, but in many places the Germans were the ones brave or foolish enough to emerge. Some carried white cloths, others waved their arms and shouted greetings. A few held small trees decorated with candles or tinsel. British soldiers watched in disbelief, rifles at the ready but fingers frozen on the triggers. Officers barked warnings, ordering their men to stay down. The idea of fraternizing with the enemy was not only discouraged, it was a court-martial offense. But something deeper than orders stirred in the hearts of the soldiers. They had sung together the night before. They had heard the same melodies. They had felt the same longing. The thought that these men could be duplicitous seemed almost impossible. Slowly, Cautiously, a few British soldiers climbed out of their trenches. They moved with hesitation, glancing back at their officers for approval they knew they would not receive. Rivulets of melted frost trickled down their boots as they stood upright in the open for the first time in months. For several long seconds, the battlefield held its breath. Then, as if some invisible barrier shattered, more men began climbing out. A handful at first, then dozens. The tension eased as it became clear that no one intended harm. The Germans advanced a few yards into no man's land. The British did the same. They met in the middle, where the earth was churned by shells and littered with debris. And for the first time, they looked each other in the eyes without the filter of a rifle scope. Many later described that first meeting as awkward. Men shuffled their feet, unsure of what to say or how to behave. They were soldiers, trained to fight, not diplomats. Some extended hands in greeting. Others offered cigarettes, chocolate, or tins of food. A German soldier produced a bottle of schnapps, holding it out with a grin. A British private reciprocated with a small plum pudding his mother had sent him. What began as tentative gestures soon blossomed into animated conversation. Both sides laughed as they tried to communicate through broken German and broken English. They pointed to their uniforms, comparing buttons and badges. They exchanged names and hometowns. Photographs were pulled from pockets. Small creased pictures of wives, children, sweethearts, parents, and shared proudly. There was astonishment on both sides at how ordinary the enemy looked. One British corporal remarked that the Germans seemed quite like ourselves, though many hadn't shaved in days and looked thin from hunger. German soldiers, in turn, marvelled at how young some of the British lads were. A few had barely grown into their uniforms. In some sectors, officers tried to halt the fraternization, urging their men back into the trenches. But many officers were just as moved by the sight as their soldiers. Some allowed the meetings to continue reluctantly, reasoning that a brief respite from the killing could do no harm. Others realized quickly that they were witnessing something historic and chose not to interfere. The ground between the trenches became a gathering place. Men walked carefully across the frozen mud, skirting the edges of shell holes filled with icy water. The bodies of fallen soldiers, left for weeks or months because retrieving them had been too dangerous, lay scattered across no man's land. Their presence was impossible to ignore. Almost immediately, men from both sides agreed to use the truce to bury the dead. British and German soldiers worked side by side, lifting bodies with gentleness and placing them into hastily dug graves. In one sector, they performed a joint funeral service, with chaplains from both armies offering prayers in their respective languages. Candles flickered in the morning breeze as men removed their caps and bowed their heads. The words spoken that day were simple, but they carried a weight that transcended language barriers. They honoured the fallen not as British or German, but as sons, brothers and fathers who had been swallowed by a war none of them had imagined. The emotional impact of these burials was profound. Many soldiers later wrote that it was the first time they had been able to mourn properly. The constant pressure of the front rarely allowed for grief. There was no space for it amid the gunfire and the mud. But on Christmas Day, with the guns quiet and their enemies beside them, the soldiers felt the full weight of their losses. Tears were shed openly. Letters later described how the simple dignity of the moment lingered long after the truce ended. After the burials, the mood shifted again. The somberness gave way to a more festive spirit. Men exchanged small gifts, buttons from tunics, brass belt buckles, cigarettes, slices of sausage, pieces of chocolate or marzipan. Some traded hats, laughing as they modelled each other's uniforms. A few swapped names and addresses, promising to visit each other after the war. Though many of these promises would go unfulfilled, the intent behind them spoke to a deep longing for a future free of conflict. The conversations that took place in no man's land varied widely. Some talked about football clubs, comparing favourite teams. Others discussed family traditions, asking about how Christmas was celebrated in distant towns and villages. A few argued good-naturedly about the causes of the war, each blaming their governments rather than the men in front of them. But always, the exchanges were warm, human, and tinged with disbelief. Perhaps the most extraordinary part of that morning was how natural it all felt once the initial hesitation had faded. The men spoke not as enemies, but as equals. They shared stories, jokes, and tobacco as if they had known each other for years. One British lieutenant later wrote that he felt as though he was spending Christmas among friends, not foes, a sentiment echoed in countless letters home. Officers in some sectors went so far as to negotiate short-term ceasefires to last through the day or into the following morning. They agreed to refrain from firing unless provoked, and promised to warn each other if artillery strikes were planned. These informal agreements varied from one part of the front to another, but in many places they held, long enough for the men to breathe freely, if only for a day. As the sun climbed higher, the landscape glittered with frost. The air carried the mingled scents of cigar smoke, roasted meat, and the faint sweetness of chocolate. Laughter echoed where gunfire had thundered only days before. It was impossible not to imagine that the war itself had paused, that humanity had pushed its way to the surface despite every attempt to bury it. It would not last forever. The soldiers knew this. The truce was temporary, fragile and unofficial. But in those precious hours on Christmas Day, the front lines felt less like a place of destruction, and more like a gathering of travellers caught in the same storm. They had found, in the unlikeliest of circumstances, a moment of peace. By afternoon, the truce would deepen even further. Gifts would give way to games, and games to shared celebrations that defied the very purpose of war. But on this morning, this extraordinary Christmas morning, the thing that mattered most was simple. The guns were quiet. For the first time in months, the world felt briefly whole. Part 4. A Christmas like no other. Games, gifts, and brotherhood. By late morning on Christmas Day, the eerie wonder of the German and British soldiers meeting in no man's land had softened into something both extraordinary and strangely ordinary. The initial disbelief had faded. The handshakes, the careful steps across the frozen mud, the nervous glances back towards disapproving officers, these had already transformed into more confident gestures. Shoulders relaxed. Laughter grew louder. The men stepped more boldly into the open, as though they were walking across an old village green instead of a battlefield. Once the solemn work of burying the dead was completed, the mood shifted towards celebration. Whether out of relief, hunger for companionship, or the powerful pull of the holiday, It was as though the soldiers collectively decided that the morning's miracle deserved to stretch into something greater. Food became one of the first sources of camaraderie. British soldiers opened tins of bully beef or jam and offered them to the Germans, who responded with smoked sausages, chocolate, slices of cake, and even bottles of beer or schnapps. One German soldier, who had been a baker before the war, proudly handed out pieces of stollen wrapped in wax paper. A British corporal, delighted, traded him a tin of plum pudding in return. Another pair exchanged their rationed spirits, British rum for German schnapps, and toasted to peace on earth, a phrase that struck both men deeply enough that they fell quiet after the first sip. The generosity didn't stop there. Cigarettes and cigars changed hands constantly. Many British soldiers had received packets in their Christmas tins from King George, each embossed with a small portrait of the monarch. Germans, in turn, shared their prized hand-rolled smokes, lighting them with matches whose sulphurous scent mingled with the cold air. For a brief time, the wasteland of no man's land smelled more like the corner outside a warm tavern on a winter's night than a battleground. Other gifts followed. Buttons popped off coats with swift, practiced gestures as soldiers traded small insignia and uniform pieces like souvenirs. Brass belt buckles were passed around, admired and pocketed. A German lieutenant produced a harmonica from his coat and played a spirited tune, while British soldiers clapped along in rhythm. The sound carried across the frosty landscape, rising above the remnants of barbed wire and broken earth. Language barriers made conversation slow, but not impossible. Many Germans spoke at least some English, having worked in British cities before the war. Others managed with gestures, laughter, or a handful of learned phrases. British soldiers did their best to respond in German, often mangling the pronunciation and provoking good-natured smiles. The warmth of the encounter softened the edges of every translation error. The most famous events of the day, those that have echoed through the decades, were the games. It began casually, almost as a joke. A German private, rummaging through his haversack, produced a leather football. British soldiers let out a cheer as he held it aloft. In England, Scotland, and Wales, the love for the game ran deep, and many men at the front had played for local clubs before the war. The idea of kicking a ball on Christmas Day felt so natural, so familiar, that it seemed momentarily to close the gap between this frozen battlefield and the grassy fields back home. Accounts vary on how many football matches took place and where. Some stories speak of dozens. Others insist there were only a handful. Some matches were little more than spirited scrambles in areas where the ground was flat enough to allow it. In one sector, soldiers described the game as more of an enthusiastic kicking contest than a match. 30 or 40 men rushing toward the ball in a flurry of boots and laughter. The field, dotted with shell holes and strewn with debris, made any kind of strategy impossible. But it didn't matter. The joy wasn't in scoring. It was in the act itself. A British rifleman later wrote that he had never seen Germans laugh so hard as when one of their officers slipped into a half-frozen crater while chasing the ball. The officer emerged splattered with mud up to his waist, grinning sheepishly as the men roared in amusement. The game ended with no clear winner, though British soldiers insisted afterward that they had scored the lone goal. German letters from the same area claimed the opposite. The truth hardly mattered. The moment had become a legend. Not all games involved football. In some sectors, soldiers engaged in makeshift snowball fights. In others, they challenged each other to contests of strength. Arm wrestling, tug of war with ropes salvaged from damaged equipment, or foot races across relatively clear patches of ground. One story describes a Scottish soldier teaching a group of Germans how to play hopscotch using lines drawn in the frost. Another recounts a German officer showing British men how to fold paper stars, a skill he had learned as a child. Even the officers, who had tried earlier to maintain decorum, found themselves drawn into the merriment. An English major, after a long conversation with a German captain about their pre-war lives, concluded their exchange by offering the German a cigar from his private stash. The German accepted with a small bow and offered his own cigarette case in return, the silver cover engraved with his family crest. For many soldiers, the most touching moments were the quiet ones. Men sat together on overturned ammunition crates, sharing photographs and telling stories of their families. Some found companions in unexpected ways. A British soldier and a German soldier who both played the violin, for example, comparing notes on their favorite composers. Another pair bonded over a mutual love of dogs, laughing as they mimicked the barking of terriers back home. During the afternoon, a group of Germans began singing a traditional carol again, their voices rising firmly into the cold air. The British joined in, just as they had the night before. This time, instead of calling across the divide, they stood shoulder to shoulder. The sound came from one place, carried upward by breath that steamed in the frigid air. It was not long before someone pulled out a small tin whistle, and the notes blended beautifully with the harmonica. For a brief time, No Man's Land felt like a gathering of old friends, celebrating a holiday far from home. The battlefield, stripped of its violence, became a stage for a fragile kind of unity. As the afternoon wore on, the sunlight weakened. The air grew sharper, biting at fingers and cheeks. Soldiers stamped their feet to keep warm, pulling coats tighter around their bodies. Still, they lingered, unwilling for the moment to end. Every shared laugh, every exchanged gift, deepened the sense that this day would be unlike any other in their lives. Many wrote later that they had never known such mixture of joy and sorrow. Joy, because the fraternity felt genuine. The men saw in each other reflections of themselves, young, weary, frightened, longing for normalcy. And sorrow, because they knew instinctively that the moment was temporary. The war had not ended. The lines had not vanished. The soldiers would eventually return to their trenches, their rifles, and their fear. Yet even with that knowledge, they cherished the hours they had. They clung to the warmth that blossomed briefly in the cold heart of the front. For a single Christmas day, the world had taken a breath. Enemy had spoken to enemy, as though they were neighbors sharing a holiday meal, not combatants locked in a deadly struggle. As the light faded and the sky dimmed, the games slowed. Men gathered their exchanged treasures, buttons, badges, photographs, small scraps of memory, and tucked them into their uniform pockets. The last notes of music drifted into the dusk. The truce would continue into the evening in some sectors, but already the weight of what came next was settling over the field. For now, though, it was enough that they had played together, sung together, and shared their meagre treats in a place where such things seemed impossible. It was enough that, For one extraordinary day, the men in no man's land had glimpsed a peace the world had forgotten. Part 5. Burying the Fallen Together. As afternoon settled into early evening, the laughter and games gradually gave way to something quieter, deeper, and more solemn. For all its wonder, the Christmas Truce had not erased the brutal reality of what lay beneath the soldiers' feet. Long after the songs faded and the footballs rested in the mud, the men in no man's land were confronted with the remains of those who had never made it home. And for many soldiers, this task, this shared act of humanity, became the most unforgettable part of the day. No man's land had been a graveyard long before Christmas morning. Bodies had lain there for weeks, some since the earliest battles of October and November. Many had fallen during failed charges or night patrols, too exposed to retrieve under fire. Rain, frost, and time had altered their appearances, but not the grief felt by those who recognized uniforms, faces, or even small details. A distinctive boot, a torn sleeve, a familiar scarf. Death on the Western Front had become so constant that men often hardened themselves against it, burying their emotions in the same mud that swallowed their friends. But on December 25th, the guns were quiet. For the first time in months, the front allowed room for sorrow. German and British soldiers began gathering the fallen with a kind of reverence that defied the chaos of war. They moved slowly, speaking little, lifting bodies from the frozen ground or from the bottoms of shell craters that had filled with icy water. Many worked in pairs, one British, one German, supported by a mutual understanding that no training had ever prepared them for this. Their breath rose in plumes of white as they carried the dead toward hastily chosen burial sites. Some wiped at their faces with soiled gloves, unsure whether they were brushing away cold or tears. Near one sector, a group of soldiers cleared an area of debris and began digging graves in the hardened earth. Their shovels struck the frozen ground with dull, rhythmic thuds. Each thud echoed across the quiet battlefield, marking a grim but necessary ritual. The trenches faded from their minds. The barbed wire, the distant parapets, the threat of violence, all seemed secondary to the task at hand. In another area, a British private recognized the body of a young German boy he had seen through a periscope weeks earlier. He had never known the soldier's name, only that he had looked barely old enough to shave. Something in the boy's stillness struck him, and he paused, placing his hand gently over the soldier's heart before lifting him with help from a German comrade. Moments like these blurred the distinctions between uniforms. The grief was not German or British. It was simply human. As the graves were prepared, officers and chaplains stepped forward to conduct simple services. The sight of opposing armies standing shoulder to shoulder while prayers were spoken was unlike anything the modern world had seen. A British chaplain, wrapped tightly in his greatcoat against the cold, opened a small prayer book with trembling fingers. His voice cracked as he read familiar passages meant to comfort the living. A German chaplain stood beside him, alternating lines in his own language. Their words intertwined like the carols of the night before, separate yet bound together by meaning. Some soldiers who understood neither German nor English bowed their heads anyway. The words mattered less than the act of mourning itself. In one burial, a British and a German officer read Psalm 23 together. Their voices merged softly into the winter air. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." Men recited the lines along with them, some silently, some choking back tears that had waited months for release. A few soldiers clutched small tokens, lockets, bracelets, scraps of letters that had been recovered from the dead. These were placed carefully on the bodies, offerings of dignity in a place that had so often denied it. Once each burial service concluded, soldiers stepped forward one by one to lay makeshift crosses crafted from broken rifle stocks, scrap wood, or twisted lengths of wire. The crosses were uneven, crooked, and fragile, but they stood proudly in the cold ground. Some men etched names if they were known. Others inscribed brief messages: brother, comrade, son, unknown, but not forgotten. It was in these moments that the emotional weight of the day became nearly overwhelming. Men who had laughed hours earlier now wept openly, overwhelmed by the enormity of what they were doing, honoring those they had once been ordered to kill, mourning strangers as though they were kin. The Germans treated British bodies with the same care as their own, and the British did likewise. One British lance corporal later wrote that he had been struck by the tenderness with which a group of German soldiers wrapped a fallen Highlander in a blanket. They handled him, he wrote, as though he were one of their own boys. Perhaps the most haunting image of that Christmas afternoon was the sound of hymns rising again over no man's land, not as carols this time, but as laments. "O come, all ye faithful, and abide with me," drifted across the fields, sung through cracked voices. Even those who stayed silent could feel the way the melodies pulled at the heart, reminding everyone of how thin the line was between life and death, joy and sorrow, peace and war. The burials continued until the light began to fade. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the grave markers cast long shadows across the snow-dusted ground. The men who had worked so diligently stood for a final moment, gazing across the rows of freshly dug earth. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell from a nearby village tolled faintly. The sound mingled with the rustle of freezing wind and the soft murmur of prayers whispered under breath. By the time the soldiers returned to their trenches, darkness had settled in. The brief magic of the afternoon lingered behind them like a fading lantern. They carried the memory with them, the physical labor, the shared grief, the extraordinary sight of enemies laying their dead to rest together. These images would remain etched in their minds for the rest of their lives. For many who experienced it, the burials became the emotional core of the truce. The games and gifts brought joy, the carols brought hope, but the shared mourning brought understanding. It revealed the truth that soldiers on both sides had known privately, that beneath the uniforms and orders, they were all simply human beings caught in a catastrophe far larger than themselves. As they stepped back into their separate trenches that night, the men knew the peace would not last. The war would resume. The guns would thunder again. But for one holy day, they had carved out a space where humanity prevailed, where compassion drowned out hatred, and where even the dead were honored with the dignity they deserved. Part 6. When Command Found Out. Orders, Outrage, and the End of the Miracle. As night settled over the front on Christmas Day, the glow of lanterns and smouldering fires flickered along the edges of both the British and German trenches. Snow drifted lightly down, softening the outlines of barbed wire and filling shell holes with pale, cold light. In some sectors, soldiers lingered in no man's land longer than they should have, talking in low tones or exchanging final gifts before returning to their own lines. Others retreated reluctantly back into their dugouts, carrying with them scraps of chocolate, new cigarettes, or a button traded from an enemy uniform. For a brief moment, it felt as though the peace might extend into the night, perhaps even into the next day. But as the world darkened, so too did the mood within the officers' shelters. The news of the truce had begun to ripple through the chain of command, and the reaction from senior officers on both sides was immediate, alarmed, and deeply disapproving. To those far behind the front lines, sitting in warm headquarters with maps spread across polished tables, the idea of fraternization with the enemy was nothing short of a threat to military discipline. War relied on order, hierarchy, obedience, and the cultivation of an emotional distance from the foe. Anything that undermined that distance was dangerous. It was one thing for soldiers to refrain from killing out of necessity. It was another entirely to treat the enemy as equals, or as friends. British General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien was among the first to react. Upon learning that his troops had met the Germans in no man's land, exchanged gifts and even played games, he issued a furious order condemning the inappropriate behavior and insisting that any repeat of such fraternization would be met with severe punishment. He reminded his officers that the enemy was cruel and remorseless, and that friendliness only encouraged laxity. High command on the German side responded with similar disdain. Officers at corps and army level demanded explanations, questioning whether their men had been tricked or manipulated. Reports of shared burials, joint services, and mingled singing spread rapidly, generating an unease born not of tactical risk, but of something deeper. Fear that the soldiers might begin questioning the war itself. On the front lines, the officers who had witnessed the truce firsthand were caught in a difficult position. Many had allowed the fraternization out of compassion or out of resignation, recognizing that to deny their men a moment of peace on Christmas would have been cruel. Others had tried to restrict it, only to find that the momentum of the day swept past their attempts to impose control. Now they stood between the wrath of their superiors and the quiet hope of their men. The evening grew colder. Lanterns dimmed. Men gathered in their dugouts, speaking in hushed voices about the extraordinary day they had lived through. Some wondered whether the peace would continue into the second day of Christmas, as it did in Germany. Others speculated that the High Command might tolerate a brief extension, so long as both sides refrained from conflict. But as dawn broke on December 26th, the fragile miracle began to crack. In many sectors, the Germans and British approached their parapets once more, calling out tentative greetings. The ground between the trenches still bore the footprints and scattered remains of the previous day's gatherings, bits of twine, scraps of wrapping, discarded tins, and the marks of games played in the snow. A few brave souls raised their hands in greeting, but this time the officers yelled for them to get down. A British captain shouted that the truce was over, ordering his men to prepare their rifles. A German NCO barked commands to return to positions. The atmosphere that had been peaceful, even joyful, was suddenly tight with apprehension. In some sectors, the men resisted quietly. A British private called across to the Germans, wishing them well. A German replied in kind. There were places along the line where soldiers on both sides agreed to extend the ceasefire for a few more hours, declining to fire on each other out of mutual respect. But not everywhere. As orders from headquarters filtered down, artillery batteries behind both lines prepared barrages meant to remind the front that the war was still on. The first shells exploded with thunderous force, sending plumes of earth and snow into the sky. The silence shattered. Men dove instinctively for cover, their hearts pounding. The officer's message was unmistakable. The peace had ended. In some areas, machine guns rattled sporadically, not aimed at the trenches themselves, but fired into the air or across empty ground to break the lingering sense of camaraderie. Soldiers who had shaken hands the day before now crouched behind parapets, unable to look at the enemy lines without feeling a profound ache. There were reports of men deliberately shooting high, unwilling to harm those they had come to know, even briefly. Others refused outright. One British soldier wrote later that he could not bring himself to aim at the Germans for weeks afterward. "I saw their faces," he wrote. "I knew their names." Command reacted swiftly to these hesitations. Units that had participated in the most extensive fraternization were reassigned to quieter sectors, or in some cases to more active ones where fighting would quickly harden any sentimental softness. Officers issued sharp reminders of military law. Patrols were ordered strictly, ensuring that no man's land remained dangerous. Any lingering gifts, swapped hats, or captured souvenirs were to be hidden away. And yet, despite the attempts to bury it, the memory of Christmas Day lingered stubbornly. Soldiers carried it with them as they returned to the rhythm of firing, ducking, and surviving. The guns roared again, but the knowledge that peace had been possible, even fleetingly, changed something within them. Letters home in the days that followed expressed a mix of wonder and sorrow. Many soldiers told their families that they had experienced something beautiful. Others admitted they felt guilty, as though the war demanded that they shouldn't have allowed themselves a moment of humanity. A few worried that newspapers would twist the story into something unrecognizable. Command tried to minimize the event in official records, but the truth seeped through. The truce was too widespread, too extraordinary, too unforgettable to hide. Stories spread through the ranks like embers, glowing in the minds of those who had glimpsed the world as it might have been. The war would grind on for nearly 4 more years, growing even more brutal with each passing season. Gas attacks, artillery barrages, and offensives of unimaginable scale would harden the front into something far darker than the winter of 1914 had been. But none of that erased the memory of the day when the guns went quiet. The officers could force the war to resume. They could punish fraternization, launch new offensives, and order men back to the trenches. But they could not undo the moment when the soldiers themselves had taken peace into their own hands. For one day, the world had shown a different face. And though command may have disapproved, the men at the front had felt something their superiors could not extinguish. They had felt hope. Part 7. Legend, Memory, and the Christmas Spirit. In the days that followed the Christmas Truce, the Western Front returned to its grim rhythm. rifle fire crackling across frozen fields, artillery shells shaking the earth, and patrols creeping nervously through the night. Snow continued to fall, settling over the scars of no man's land until the footprints and makeshift game fields of Christmas Day were erased. Yet something lingered in the hearts of the men who had taken part in the miracle. They carried it with them like a warm ember tucked beneath layers of wool and mud. The memory of a day where, for reasons no strategist could explain, the war had paused. For many soldiers, the truce became a story they told in whispers, unsure whether others would believe it. Some feared ridicule, others feared reprimand. But thousands of letters had already crossed the Channel. Letters written on Christmas night, or in the earliest hours of December 26th, penned by men still glowing with the shock and tenderness of what they had experienced. These letters reached homes across Britain, France, and Germany. Families gathered around kitchen tables, reading aloud words that seemed almost impossible. Sons and brothers wrote of shaking hands with the enemy. They described burying the dead together, sharing food, laughing over the absurdity of the war, and hearing voices that only a day earlier had felt terrifying now sound almost familiar. Many parents wept as they read these letters, not only from relief but from awe. For a fleeting moment, the brutality of modern war had been interrupted by a reminder of the world as it once was, and as it might be again. In London and Paris, newspapers printed excerpts. In Berlin, rumours spread through cafes and taverns, carrying both pride and confusion. Editors struggled to make sense of the reports. The truce didn't fit neatly into any narrative of nationalism, heroism, or martial glory. It wasn't sanctioned, it wasn't strategic, it was simply human. Some politicians downplayed it, others ignored it. But the public would not forget. And neither would the soldiers. As winter turned to spring, the war intensified. Poison gas was introduced in 1915, staining the fields of Ypres with clouds of yellow and green. New offensives were planned, each deadlier than the last. The trenches deepened, widened, and multiplied. Machine guns grew more efficient. Artillery became more devastating. The Western Front hardened into a place where hope often felt like a dangerous indulgence. In later Christmases, commanders took great care to ensure that no truce could ever unfold again. Artillery barrages were scheduled for the holiday. Patrols were increased. Threats of punishment were enforced. And indeed, there was no repeat of the widespread fraternization that had blossomed so naturally in 1914. But the memory of that first Christmas remained, stubborn and brilliant. Soldiers spoke of it in dugouts, passing the story along like a treasured heirloom. Men who had not been there envied those who had. Some units even held small private moments of respect on future Christmases, exchanging quiet nods or whispered greetings across the lines, even as the guns thundered above them. These gestures were fleeting, easily swallowed by the violence of the war, but they carried a quiet defiance. When the war finally ended in 1918, the world struggled to comprehend the scale of its devastation. Entire landscapes had been remade into wastelands. Millions of young men had been lost. And yet, even in the midst of mourning, the Christmas truce resurfaced, like a small flame in a darkened room, illuminating what humanity had been capable of even in its bleakest hour. It was remembered in memoirs, letters, and oral histories. Veterans spoke of it to their children and grandchildren, often with tears in their eyes. For men who had endured the horrors of trench warfare, the memory of that silent, peaceful day became one of the few bright threads woven through an otherwise brutal tapestry. In the decades that followed, the Christmas Truce became a symbol. Artists, poets, and playwrights portrayed it with reverence. Songs were written, most famously, Christmas in the Trenches, capturing the poignancy of the moment through the eyes of fictionalized soldiers. Paintings depicted the men standing together in the snow, their helmets frosted, their faces softened by candlelight. Films and documentaries retold the story, each adding a new layer of emotion to what was already one of the Great War's most extraordinary moments. Even historians, trained to separate myth from fact, found it difficult to treat the truce as a mere anecdote. It was too well documented, too widespread, too deeply felt. And yet, its power lay not only in what happened, but in what people believed it meant. The truce became a reminder, a lesson whispered through generations, that even amid the most violent conflicts, there exists a part of the human spirit that refuses to be extinguished. It showed that soldiers who had been ordered to kill could choose, even for a day, to honor life instead. It proved that compassion could rise in the most unlikely of places. And it revealed something profoundly universal, that beneath uniforms, nationalities, and political motives, human beings share a longing for peace, warmth, and connection. The power of the truce endures not because it brought the war to an end, but because it did not. Its beauty is sharpened by its fragility. The men knew their peace was temporary. They knew the guns would roar again. And yet they embraced the moment anyway, clinging to what little humanity the war had left them. In that sense, the Christmas Truce represents the very essence of the Christmas spirit. Hope in darkness, light in coldness, and goodwill extended without reason or reward. It is a story that transcends time, reminding each new generation that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of understanding. More than a century later, the legacy of the Christmas Truce endures in candlelit services, in memorials across Europe, and in the hearts of those who hear the story for the first time. It is a testament to the idea that even at humanity's lowest, there is still something within us capable of rising, something that recognizes the humanity in others, even when nations are at war. And every Christmas, when carols drift across snowy fields or flicker through quiet homes, it is easy to imagine that somewhere in the distance, those voices from 1914 still echo, softly, bravely, defiantly, reminding us of the day when enemies became brothers, if only for a moment. Conclusion: the light that would not die out. As the final hours of Christmas Day slipped into evening, the Western Front slowly returned to its terrible purpose. The soldiers who had walked together through no man's land now drifted back into the narrow safety of their trenches, each carrying with him the weight of a miracle and the certainty of what tomorrow would bring. The candles that had glowed along the German parapets guttered out one by one. The last harmonica notes faded into the cold, and the dark, familiar shape of war stretched itself awake once more. Yet something had changed. Even as rifle bolts were checked, even as officers resumed their sharp commands, and even as the distant thunder of artillery began again, the memory of the truce stayed warm in the hearts of those who had lived it. What happened on Christmas Day 1914 did not alter the course of the war. It did not shorten it. It did not end the suffering or break the stalemate. But in a conflict defined by impersonal violence and industrial-scale death, the Christmas Truce revealed something profoundly important. That humanity, even when buried beneath mud and misery, was not gone. For the men who experienced it, the truce became a quiet lantern they carried through the rest of the war. In the years that followed, in battles far more devastating than anything seen in 1914, soldiers would think back to the day when the guns went quiet, when laughter filled the air instead of smoke, and when hands reached out across the barbed wire, not to harm, but to greet. Some veterans later said that this memory sustained them more than any ration or dry pair of socks ever could. It reminded them that the war, brutal as it was, could not fully strip them of their humanity. History has a way of magnifying the extraordinary, and the Christmas Truce became one of its brightest magnifications. It was retold in letters, in poems, in stories passed from family to family. It was reenacted in plays and memorial services. It was sung about, painted, written down, and cherished. And each retelling carried the same message. Even in the darkest winter of the world, a small flame can still glow against the cold. The story of the truce endures because it speaks to something timeless. It reminds us that peace often begins as a whisper, a gesture, a song carried across a quiet night. It reminds us that even enemies can find common ground in shared humanity. And it reminds us that hope, once kindled, can survive almost anything, even the Great War. As we close this chapter of holiday history, I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Think of those soldiers standing in the snow more than a century ago, cold, hungry, frightened, yet still able to look into the eyes of those they were told to hate and see something familiar, something precious, something worth remembering. Thank you for spending your time with me tonight, and for honoring this remarkable moment in history by listening, imagining, and keeping its memory alive. If you enjoyed this episode and want to support the creation of ad-free, cozy historical storytelling, I would be grateful if you considered joining our Patreon. Your support helps keep holiday history warm, inviting, and independent, and it allows us to keep bringing centuries of traditions to life, one story at a time. Until next time, may the light of Christmas, its kindness, its courage, and its quiet hope stay with you wherever you are.